Hey guys, so I started watching Nomad a few weeks ago and holy shit, that might be my anime of the year as far as I'm concerned. Nomad has this amazing, it has this vibe that really sucks you in. It really puts you into the story. It makes you feel like you're there in a way that I've only seen pulled off by a really good Batman or an Evangelion movie. But it was a very long road to get me to watching Nomad. You see, Nomad is the second season of Megalobox. Megalobox came out a year or two ago, and while Nomad is quite shockingly its own thing, completely original, the first season of Megalobox, on the other hand, is pretty much a very strange, sideways sci-fi remix of the best parts of the original Ashita no Joe. Now, I've long heard the legend of Ashita no Joe, the supposedly most influential manga in Japanese history, the legendary boxing anime with some of the most detailed, cutting-edge anime of the 1970s that was so cutting-edge it pushed the entire industry forward to make some of the most luxuriously hand-detailed, hand-drawn animations ever made. So with all that good news in front of me, I decided to take the plunge and watch all of Ashita no Joe from the beginning in the 70s. Oh, and I might as well say, as far as season 1 of Ashita no Joe is concerned, the animation really does live up to its reputation. It has this crazy super fluid motion that I've really never seen executed anywhere else on such a level. So my only guess is that this anime was maybe animated in 60 frames per second or something like that, because it has this strange, super smooth look that I've just never really seen executed before. Now, I'm going to do this video a little bit different than my usual stuff. I'm definitely going to do it differently than the last couple of franchise overviews I've done. Now, for this first video I'm doing, I just want to hit on the best episode of Ashita no Joe, and then I'll do a full teardown of Megalobox and Nomad in another video or two, because those series are just different series, and quite frankly, before I talk about them, I gotta talk about Classic Joe, and there's a lot of Classic Joe to go through. Now, Ashita no Joe is a very weird, interesting anime. Spoilers for the original Ashita no Joe lie ahead if you care. If you've maybe only seen Megalobox, you might kind of be able to piece these together. But anyway, I'm going to start off by explaining that the story of Ashita no Joe starts as a manga and then very quickly gets an anime adaptation in 1970. Now, while the manga was still being written, the anime adaptation is still going on, and it's super popular, but it's the 1970s. Anime TV executives in the 1970s are idiots, and they canceled the show about 75% through the manga story, which is incredibly disappointing. They canceled it in a really depressing part of the story, but nonetheless, they canceled it right before it was about to finish. Now, just for the sake of clarity, as I'm talking about Ashita no Joe, I'm going to break it up into a couple of DBZ-style major arcs, based on ways that I felt like the story was being structured. So I'm going to break it down into the prologue arc, the prison arc, the Rikishi arc, the Carlos Rivera arc, and the everything else arc. So that's 5 arcs? Yeah, sure, that's about right. Now, almost everyone who remakes or revisits the series, they always start off in the Rikishi arc, if not even further in, because they're boxing fans and they're coming here for the boxing fans. And yeah, I get it. This is the most infamous boxing anime ever. And I respect the sport of boxing. It has a brutality and a desperation to it. And even if you're great at boxing, it somehow still destroys you. But honestly, the boxing leg of the story is quite frankly where the anime turns into a pretty normal by-the-book story of a sports anime. And I'm just an all-over anime fan, so I really want to focus on those first 2 arcs, which I think are way more interesting from a story perspective. Now, the prologue arc is actually just the first 8 episodes of the show, but it's completely shocking and weird. I need to talk about the prologue because everyone hates the prologue, no one ever discusses the prologue, but I actually thought the prologue was probably the most interesting, if not the most confusing part of this anime. See, in the prologue, we're introduced to all of the main characters, and we find them in very different places from where they end up. Joe starts off as a violent homeless wanderer. Danpei, meanwhile, is a washed-up ex-boxer. Danpei, at this point in the story, is addicted to booze, has one foot in the grave and the other in the gutter. His life is pretty much in complete shambles, until he happens upon meeting Joe in the street one day, and in a single instant realizes with this crazed amount of clarity mixed with absolute insanity that if he can only turn Joe into a professional boxer, that thing will turn his life around and fix everything wrong with him. Now, this is kind of pretty awful and selfish, but hey, it's the 70s, and Joe is Danpei's last chance to have any happiness in his life. Now, for all parties involved, taking Joe from a street fighter into a professional boxer seems to be the last chance for any of them to do anything with their miserable lives. Unfortunately, when we're first introduced to Joe in the first arc, he pretty much is insane. He gives zero fucks about anything, especially other people, their lives, or the law. The prologue arc of Joe is just absolutely shocking, especially for something coming out of the 70s, because it mixes together this level of reality with this level of violence that I'm just not used to seeing in an anime, especially not in this time period. The prologue arc, even though Joe is the main character, he's an evil, absolutely unredeemable prick. He would be the villain in most anime, which is not something I would see done conventionally until like The Wolf of Wall Street or, I don't know, Death Note. Joe spends the first 8 episodes of the show, which seem like an eternity, just fucking up real estate, accosting the rich, pissing people off, tricking children into doing crimes for him, and when all else fails, committing crimes himself. So as a result, this eventually catches up to him and he gets arrested and sent off to prison, which sets up the prison arc. Now, the prison arc by and large sucks because being in prison sucks, especially if you're in prison in a DBZ-based anime. Now, at this point, we get into what I personally consider the best absolute episode of the original Ashita no Joe. This is the first episode where the show suddenly clicks into place in my mind and where the show suddenly makes sense to me. In episode 9, we are introduced to Rikishi Toru. Now, as I mentioned up until this point in the anime, despite being the main character, the quote-unquote hero of this anime, Yabukijo is a ruthless, heinous bastard on a non-stop downward journey into life. Now, by all accounts, Rikishi Toru shows up, and he is the hero of this anime. He is the hero come to stop the villain Yabukijo. In my personal opinion, the best episode of Ashita no Joe is episode 9, because this starts off the prison arc, and this is the first appearance of Rikishi Toru, the quote-unquote main character of the series. If you've put up with Joe committing crimes for the first 8 episodes to reach the prison arc, this anime must have felt really weird and a little bit pointless at some times. Now, at this point in the anime, Joe is literally just a psycho anime protagonist with no direction in life, just committing crimes and not listening to literally his extremely large support circle who just want him to stop committing crimes. Episode 9 starts off with Joe trapped in a prison bus with Mammoth Nishi. They're in this truck being hauled off to prison with a bunch of straight-up psychopaths. Nishi is scared for his life and Joe is traditionally peaceful until he's suddenly in the mood to beat down some fuckers. Now Nishi tells Joe to cut it out because these guys are all killers, and Joe, being a fucking idiot asshole, thinks that prison is not a big deal and he will easily escape somehow. Now, eventually a few days of hard labor go by and he realizes that he's trapped in a fucking prison, and he stares longingly at the ocean seeing a ship go by. He stares so longingly that he accidentally cuts his hand on a fence, and he's just caught up in the moment as he bleeds on a fence. Anyway, at this point some dude tries to jump Joe, but Joe successfully defends himself from getting butt raped and scares off the guy, threatening to smash open his skull with a sledgehammer. The guards do nothing about this because it's the 70s and it's Asia, and they just want to watch him closely because they think he's trying to escape. Now, we briefly touch on a B story with Joe's gang of rabid children and Danpei still living it up in the ghetto. They get into a fight with a fortune teller because the fortune teller says Joe will be in prison forever. At this point, Danpei confronts Yoko, the rich, how would I describe Yoko? Yoko is a person who will not butt out of Joe's business. Yoko is a busybody, I suppose. Anyway, Yoko tells Danpei that if Joe becomes a boxer, it will stop him from trying to escape from jail. I don't know how she knows this because she's not in jail with Joe. But anyway, this is apparently the start of Yoko's elaborate plan to bring boxing to jail, to rehabilitate the prisoners in jail, and also make herself a little bit richer because she owns a boxing company. Now, from there on, we get some grimly drawn farm animals while Joe and Nishi are still putting up with all these psychopaths. And Toru Rikishi suddenly bites into our lives. Instantly, he has this swaggery John Cena-like theme song playing to announce his greatness to the world. Rikishi came to talk to Joe and give him Yoko's postcard. He throws the postcard in the mud though because Joe addresses him rudely, and then as Joe tries to pick it up, Rikishi runs over his hand with a bike and exits the scene. Joe picks up the postcard, realizes it's from Yoko, sees a picture of the Virgin Mary on it, and Joe rips it up without reading it because he fucking hates Yoko. She's a busybody. Anyway, meanwhile, the prison psychopaths are planning to do something completely fucked up to Joe and Nishi, and they've surrounded them and pushed them into an area with some grotesquely animated pigs. So the psychopaths throw Joe and Nishi into a pile of pig shit and tell them that they need to clean up this pig shit with their bare hands, and if they don't, that they will stab them to death with these pitchforks they have. Now, Joe figures he can take them, but Nishi is like, fuck it, they're going to straight up murder us with pitchforks. It is not worth dying over, let's clean up this pig shit. So Nishi and Joe start cleaning up the pig shit with the bare hands as the psychopaths ridicule them. Then suddenly, they start succeeding in cleaning up the pig shit, so the psychos get agitated and start stabbing the pigs to rile them up. Joe at this point ends up fighting a fucking pig, which is completely not helpful, but this actually inspires him to have a plan to escape. Now Nishi says that they can use the pigs to escape from jail and ride them, and Joe thinks that this is a brilliant stupid plan, so he punches even more pigs to rile up the pigs even more, and this confuses the psychopaths, and eventually the pigs finally break through the wall and attack all the psychopaths. Joe, meanwhile, rides on a fucking stampede of pigs, looking insane, and the pigs start destroying the entire prison guarding. But just as Joe is about to escape from prison in a single episode, Rikishi pulls up again on his bike, gets off the bike, and just starts mowing down these pigs. He starts dancing through the stampede of pigs and punches out a pig that Joe is riding, knocking Joe down to the ground. Joe is completely fucking shocked that anyone would stop him from escaping from prison, and Rikishi's theme song starts to play again louder. Rikishi tells Joe that he's never going to escape from prison, so Joe tries to punch Rikishi, and Rikishi knocks down Joe with a single punch. Joe is so completely shocked that someone has disciplined him for the first time ever in his life that he tells Rikishi that he hates him more than anyone he's ever met. And Rikishi makes fun of Joe because Joe starts crying at this point. So Joe says he's going to kill Rikishi. And eventually he will. But the psychos at this time laugh at Joe because how stupid it all is, and how that's not going to happen right now. So Joe punches Rikishi in the nose and makes him bleed, but that's just not it. So Rikishi won't let Joe touch him again. So Joe starts punching at this point like crazy, but Rikishi dodges every single punch and calls Joe a freaking amateur. He then knocks Joe senseless with a series of perfectly timed attacks, and fuck yeah, at this point the animation is fluid and amazing. Joe gets knocked senseless, and all the psychos say that Joe is going to die, and finally Rikishi knocks out one of Joe's front teeth. Joe expresses this massive shock, this single look of what the fuck is going on. I'm the main character of this stupid show. I've done crimes unabated up to this point. I'm an asshole. No one has ever stood up to me in my life before. This is a fucking groundbreaking experience for Joe. And meanwhile, Rikishi is cool, collected, and a great guy. And he knocks Joe unconscious and tells someone to call a medic. Joe, at this point, has a fucking seizure and starts crying like he's a fucking toddler. Rikishi tells Joe that he is a completely unskilled animal who doesn't understand him at all, and he leaves, followed by his theme song playing non-stop. Nishi at this point starts hysterically crying because he's shocked that their plan of escaping prison by riding a pig failed. And so the episode ends with Joe still dazed and unconscious. On top of that, there's also the next episode preview, which I'm going to include because it is less of a preview and more of a holy shit, did you see how bad Rikishi fucked up Joe? But this, my friends, is the turning point of the series. After this, even though Joe Yakuki is still stuck in prison, he actually takes a deep and well-needed look at himself and decides at this point to turn his life around. Mostly because he's in prison and he's got nothing better to do, but also mainly because he's driven by this urge of revenge for this beating that he got from Rikishi. So over the next couple of episodes, Joe is still stuck in prison. He starts training based on some letters he got from Dampé. Eventually, Dampé and the kids come to visit him regularly, and he starts training hard to overcome Rikishi. And everyone is fine with this since it means that Joe is finally bettering himself and actually doing something with his life, even if it's pursuing a vendetta. But it eventually builds up until eventually Joe and Rikishi have a semi-official boxing match in the prison that Yoko sets up with all her prison money. Now, this is the first match where Joe learns his signature move, the cross counter, and he uses it to knock Rikishi out for a tie. Yoko, meanwhile, continues pumping her money into the prison system, allowing more prisoners to train in boxing, which is supposedly her blessed way of curing society with boxing. Again, Yoko kind of views herself as the Virgin Mary, and at this point, the show is officially transitioning into being a boxing anime, I guess, finally. Now, the prison arc stretches on for a really hellish amount of time. It's a lot of Joe training, a lot of Joe getting his first wins over some rando prisoners, and the whole time he's just stewing in his personal hatred of Toru Rikishi. Now, if the first Rocky movie is a love story about Aso becoming a professional boxer, Ashita no Joe is a hate story about Aso becoming a professional boxer. Because the intro and the ending for the first part of the show just imply that Joe is singularly being pushed on by his singular hate for Toru Rikishi. Now, 14 episodes of prison arc later, Joe finally gets released from prison on good behavior, ending the fucking prison arc. And now we have what is sort of the beginning of being a boxer / the Wolf Kaneguchi mini arc. In this arc, Joe moves on from being a nobody to being a professional boxer with a combination of hard work and a few well-placed publicity stunts. He goes nuts a few times and generally becomes a respectable character through this arc. He has a few fights with Wolf Kaneguchi, a kind of crooked boxer, and he eventually ruins him by breaking his jaw, setting up a situation where Joe goes on to ruin many of his opponents so they can never box again. This is kind of like Joe's entire boxing career, where he just goes from opponent to opponent destroying lives. It's pretty dark. Anyway, by episode 41, we finally got into the real Rikishi arc. Now, in the first episode of the Rikishi arc, episode 41, so in episode 41, Rikishi begins this extreme weight loss training in winter clothing inside a sauna to maximize the amount of sweat he gives off, so he loses weight at a very rapid pace. Now, where the Rikishi arc gets completely ridiculous is the fact that legally, since Toru Rikishi is a featherweight boxer and Yabuki Joe is a much smaller bantamweight boxer, even though they fought in prison because that was just like whatever, because of the unfair laws of boxing, Rikishi and Joe can't fight unless Rikishi agrees to lose an unhealthy amount of weight to fight Joe. And Joe does nothing and just allows this to happen. Now, spoilers, because this all directly results in Toru Rikishi's death. I have to wonder retroactively, maybe as someone who doesn't quite get why boxing works, why didn't Joe just fatten up his skinny ass so Rikishi didn't have to starve to death? Because Toru Rikishi is literally the hero of this anime. At the start of the Rikishi arc, Rikishi literally takes over the end credits of the show. The end credits for the first half of Ashita no Joe are just this sad song about how Joe's someday gonna make it. But then it turns in this episode into this bombastic and exciting Rikishi Toru theme song about how Rikishi Toru is a real fucking boxer, a legitimate trained boxer, and Yabuki Joe is a rabid dog who should fucking live outside with the other animals. Like, this whole song just drips of swagger with how much of a Chad, better character Rikishi is over Joe. Anyway, over the next couple of episodes, Rikishi continues to just flat out torture himself to try and lose enough weight to fight Joe. And all the while, Joe is meanwhile just sharpening his fighting technique, coming up with a boxing strategy to beat Rikishi in the ring finally. So he comes up with this honestly stupid no-guard strategy of all offense, no defense. So now this all culminates in episode 46, The Man Who Risked Death. This is not my personal favorite episode, but for everyone else, this is arguably the best episode in the series. So since it's everyone else's personal favorite episode, I'll cover this one too. Now, if you saw Megalobox, the last episode of Megalobox kind of pulls from this episode hard, but it does it in such a half-assed way that it loses all its impact because it glosses over it way too fast and also makes it sci-fi, which drains it of the bleak, simple reality of a man starving to death. Now, in this episode, we're not focusing on boxing. This episode is kind of about the struggle that boxers go through to be boxers, but honestly, it's not even that. This episode is just the climax of Rikishi's insane weight loss crusade, and it's honestly the point of no return leading to his death. We rejoin Rikishi sleeping in darkness, fully hydrated, staying at the wealthy Shiraki boxing club, where Rikishi is just living in a fucking sauna. The press at this time is incredibly curious about his training methods and tries to barge in on him. Yoko shows up and dispels all the rumors going on with the press and gives them permission to talk to Rikishi. The press finally get a look at Rikishi, and he looks fucking awful. He looks like a weird skeleton beef jerky man, and Yoko has this doctor watching him around the clock to make sure he won't die from all this. Yoko assures the press that a normal person, meanwhile, would totally die from all this. And Rikishi continues miserably training in slow motion, looking sick and on the verge of death. The doctor notices this and tells Rikishi that Yoko needs to stop him now. So Yoko tells Rikishi that he's done for the day, and the press mentions that Rikishi had told them some wrong facts when they'd asked him for some details, so maybe they think he's losing his mind from all this, but the doctor clarifies that they've been lying to Rikishi to keep him from killing himself. So the press is just like tantalized by all this, so they try to get a more direct interview with Rikishi, but apparently he's just too tired to talk. And I forgot to say that during this time that Rikishi is living in a fucking locked steel cell that Yoko made, and that is also nuts. Now, the press says that they're both crazy and this gym is like a fucking insane asylum. And then in the night, a bunch of rats come into Rikishi's cell as he's being slowly driven insane by his dehydration and the sound of dripping water from the pipes of the gym. Yoko comes to check on him and suggests he gets some fresh air. So they take a quick trip to the beach on what is otherwise a crappy winter's day. Yoko stands by the water and looks about as sexy as she can manage, but instead of looking at her feminine body and all her wiles, he's fantasizing about Joe Yabuki, and he locks himself back in the car to not have fun. Yoko proceeds to frolic in the water in the middle of winter on an incredibly shitty, dreary day, and brings Rikishi back a flower. Yoko starts getting pissed at Rikishi because he won't talk to her, which I think he physically can't because he's dehydrated, and the two of them have this really weird relationship. I think they're dating, but Yoko is also his sponsor and his coach, and she treats Rikishi less like a boyfriend and more like a pet, and that she's his like fucking owner, like his fucking like, you know, jail manager. Anyway, Rikishi goes back to his cell at the gym, and he continues to be driven nuts by the leaky pipe and how badly he needs water. And by all accounts, Rikishi is literally fighting his body's natural urge to drink water. He starts further fantasizing about the ocean that he just saw and smashes the flower Yoko gave him. And finally, he can't take it anymore and goes completely crazy. He screams at the guy watching the cell and punches the door open until his hand bleeds. And I'm actually shocked he broke down the door. He's obviously dying in this moment, and he can't take the weight loss just any further. He runs to the bathroom to try and drink water out of a faucet, but Yoko has tied up all the sinks with barbed wire because Yoko is a sadist just like Rikishi. Rikishi tries to turn the faucet with the barbed wire, but he just cuts his hand even more. So he goes to another bathroom, same thing, more barbed wire. He goes to the shower, there's barbed wire on the showers too. Yoko finally shows up, and Yoko offers Rikishi a glass of hot water. Hot water is disgusting, but apparently Rikishi can't drink cold water because it will like somehow really mess him up with the condition he's in. But I guess hot water is okay. I guess I kind of can see the science in that because like the body is like naturally like 96 degrees and the cold water could like shock his nervous system. Anyway, Yoko is actually moved to tears that Rikishi has like finally like stopped like acting like this and wants water, because like him wanting water shows that he's still a human being. And Yoko even offers to cancel the boxing match if Rikishi is too sick from all this, which she should have. It would have saved his life. But Rikishi decides to not drink the water because Yoko's pity has made him realize that it's just not worth it, and this whole situation has strengthened his resolve to defeat Yabuki Joe. So this whole scene is just awkward as fuck because all this bullshit just got Toru Rikishi killed. I really wish he would have been less of a bigger man and just drank the goddamn water, or drank in any water. So yeah, episode 46 is the episode that many people consider the greatest. I do not personally consider it the greatest though, because it's one of the only episodes of the show, Ashita no Joe, with literally no Joe in it. If anything, it's the most Rikishi-focused episode of the entire series. Joe only appears for a second at the opening and is unconscious the entire episode, so they can focus on Rikishi and Yoko. Also, while episode 46 is an artistic masterpiece, I don't think it really makes any sense that this episode is kind of just about a man starving himself for his own weird reasons. So this episode kind of doesn't make any sense out of context if you just saw it by itself. Alright, so now we've covered the best episodes of Ashita no Joe. Let's cover the rest of the series now and just keep going. So pretty much right after this episode, Joe and Rikishi finally have their epic fight. And by all accounts, it is literally the most epic fight of the show. Now, despite the fact that Rikishi turned himself into beef jerky for this fight, that he starved himself, he still thoroughly kicks Joe's ass. Except Joe manages to get one lucky shot at Rikishi's head, and that one lucky shot hemorrhages Rikishi's brain because of all the fucking weight loss bullshit. That shot, combined with the frailty that Rikishi currently has, the fact that he turned his skin to beef jerky, that he made himself a fragile glass man, causes Toru Rikishi to immediately die following this fight. And when Toru Rikishi dies, that's essentially the end of Ashita no Joe, in the same way that L dying is essentially the end of Death Note. If you were considering Toru Rikishi the hero and Joe the villain, this is it. Several movie adaptations of Ashita no Joe just ended here, and by and large, from this moment on, it's all downhill. Rikishi's death is seemingly the one moment in the show, this one moment in anime history, where the main character, the guy that was beloved by the audience, dies. Toru Rikishi's death was such a big deal to like the Japanese public that they actually had a real world funeral for this man, because the public was inconsolable after his death. Not only did they have a real world funeral like I think Osaka, Japan, but over 700 people showed up. Would 700 people show up to your funeral? Think about that. Toru Rikishi was loved. I need to take a second right now to also briefly cover the live-action Ashita no Joe movie from 2011, because it literally just covers the entire story of Toru Rikishi from the beginning of the prison arc to the end of the Rikishi arc, with all of the non-Rikishi filler cut out. Funny story about this movie, I originally wanted to see this movie very, very bad, because when I moved to Japan, it was the only Japanese movie playing at the movie theater. Anyway, that was a long time ago. I eventually saw the movie, and although I cared to see it, it did some things right, but this movie sucked. It really is not worth anyone's time. It is honestly just a quick highlight reel of the Rikishi arc, and somehow it sucks compared to the anime. Despite being given drama gold with all these like dramatic story beats, they sterilize everything in the movie so much that it's somehow visually more boring and less interesting than a fucking anime from the 70s, which is shocking for a modern movie to pull off. Now, I've also heard that there was another live-action movie that was actually made in the 70s. I haven't been able to find this movie because it's lost media, but I actually would really like to see it because I think it has a really strong chance of being good compared to the 2011 version. Because it was made at the same time the manga was originally written, so I think it might actually have something that the remakes did not. But like I said, for the moment it's lost media. If you happen to have a copy of it, send it to me. I bet you have a copy of it, don't you? Anyway, following Rikishi's death, Joe moves backwards as a character and goes back to being a lone wolf slumdog wanderer. It takes a while, but he's eventually forced back into boxing. But he's traumatized from killing his friend, and he eventually starts pulling his punches, and that puts him on a losing streak. By the way, I'm going to go on a quick rant here about Yoko Shiraki too, because in reviewing this anime, and especially being more conscious of her through her counterpart in Megalobox, it just occurs to me that Yoko is such a really fucking weird character. In the prologue arc, when she's first introduced, she's straight up Joe's enemy. She's an out-of-touch, rich woman who doesn't get Joe's down to the streets poverty. She's one of the main reasons that Joe gets sent to prison, and then once he is sent to prison, she manipulates his life in the prison arc for seemingly her own amusement / financial benefit. And for the first half of the show, Joe just hates Yoko absolutely. Yoko is pretty much the absolute enemy of the show. Yoko is off on her own planet and flutters around between being a business genius, a normal rich girl, and a manipulative psycho. Now, she is seemingly romantically involved with Rikishi and egged on his unhealthy weight loss for the sake of her own gym, and did nothing to stop or delay the fight with Joe that directly led to Rikishi's death. After Rikishi dies, despite the fact that Joe justifiably hates her, and despite the fact that Joe had another pseudo-girlfriend named Noriko, who quite wisely realized that Joe was destroying himself with boxing, and was going to die, and nothing she could do could stop him from dying, Joe and Yoko bond over the fact that they both killed Rikishi, and they know it. Yoko almost falls in love with Joe, but there's not really anything romantic there. She more or just less uses him the way she used Rikishi because, again, Yoko is just some weird dominatrix psycho millionaire. Now, things finally turn around when Carlos Rivera is introduced. Carlos has a similar good guy energy, but it's different from the one Rikishi had. Like Rikishi, Carlos is another hero character to seemingly fight against Joe's depressed and mopey anti-hero. Now, Carlos is the memeiest character in the series. Despite being a Venezuelan, he drops a legendary amount of English, and everything that comes out of his mouth is pure comedy gold. Now, unfortunately, midway through the Carlos Rivera arc, the original Ashita no Joe gets cancelled, and this is, by all accounts, a crime against humanity. Now, in the real world, anime fans had to wait 10 fucking years to see the end of Ashita no Joe. But you don't, because they made it in 1980. And that brings us to Ashita no Joe 2, which unfortunately suffers the typical curse of an anime that ends in the number 2. Now, in the 1980s, Ashita no Joe 2, I don't know who the fuck made this, but whoever made it really did not get what was good about the first series, because for some incredible reason, Ashita no Joe 2 almost ruins literally everything I love about the first 1970s Ashita no Joe. All the incredible super frame rate animation from the first season, all those highly detailed movements, that is all gone in Ashita no Joe 2. But in exchange, we seemingly get a trade-off of slightly more detailed backgrounds, which are especially noticeable. Those just ooze with the glowy city pop quality that most 80s animes have. Another thing I really hate about Ashita no Joe 2 is the music. Season 1, Series 1 has this epic music that just sounds like an old Sergio Leone Western. Every character has their own Wild West theme that involves trumpets and guitars, and it really emphasizes the despair that all the characters have. But Ashita no Joe 2, not so much. Since it's a fucking 80s sports anime, the music sounds exactly what you would expect an 80s sports anime to sound like. It's all fucking synthesizers, it's all fucking 1980s workout music. It sounds like you just walked into the fucking Olympic Pavilion at Disneyland. The way they fucked up the music is the number one crime of Ashita no Joe 2. It literally goes from a fistful of dollars to Richard Simmons sweating. Lastly, they rewind the story slightly and restart the story right after Joe kills Rikishi. Now, logistically, that's the middle of the story, but that also means they completely redo the Carlos Rivera arc. Now, for the reasons I just mentioned, it's a really bad redo. Also, in Ashita no Joe 2, for whatever reason, Carlos Rivera is not the meme lord he was in the 70s version. And him not being a meme lord, that somehow reduces his likability. Now, since the animes overlap, definitely stick with the 70s version for as long as you possibly can. Anyway, after Carlos, they get into the last story arc, the quote-unquote everything else arc, which is mostly good, but it's mostly just Jose Mendoza, another Hispanic boxer who is straight up a bad guy to finally make Joe look like a good guy. But it really is a shame that the 70s Ashita no Joe got canceled so close to the goddamn end of the story. There's also a compilation movie that compiles the entirety of Ashita no Joe 2. I haven't seen it, but considering how bad Ashita no Joe 2 was, how much of a drag it was, I'm going to recommend that if you don't care about Ashita no Joe after Rikishi dies, just do yourself a favor and watch the movie of Ashita no Joe 2, because it's probably better than watching the show. Ashita no Joe has a pretty ambiguous ending, where there's really only two ways to interpret the ending. Either Joe is finally fully satisfied that he's done all he can as being a boxer, and he's done, or on top of all that, he died in his last match. Certain versions of the ending add extra details to make this ending less ambiguous about the way that he died, but I think the consensus online is that he died. Although I double checked in the manga, and in the manga it just is a complete happy ending where it's like, Joe got the fight he wanted, he's happy, the end. So it's really just the anime adding extra details to make it seem like he also died. And it's a horrible ending to what is really a horrible story. So anyway, that's my consensus on the original Ashita no Joe. Now let's pop up some review cards for the end of the road just to score everything up. The original Ashita no Joe anime from 1970 gets a 1970s 7 out of 10 for its impressive fight animation that holds up to this day, its shocking displays of crime and violence, and its epic Wild West music. The only downsides I can give it are the occasional episodes where it has this very uncoordinated, strange sense of where the fuck is this anime going, especially at the start, and the tragedy that the 70s anime does not reach the ending. But it gets close. Ashita no Joe 2, however, is so bad that I have to give it a separate grade and separately grade it a 4 out of 10. The only thing good I can say about Ashita no Joe 2 is it gets to the end of the story and most of the voice actors came back. It has worse animation than the 70s version, and it replaces the timeless Wild West score with this cliche 1980s exercise music. And on top of that, it covers the most depressing part of the story, so it's really just a full-on downer the whole way through. Also, just for good notion, I'll further give the live-action Ashita no Joe movie from 2011 a 3 out of 10, because the only thing good I can say about this is they at least got like the setting right and like managed to like firmly ground the story in the 1970s like it's supposed to be, but that somehow makes it more forgettable than the anime version, which I've already seen. Oh, and also one more tangent I need to get into. A lot of people compare Ashita no Joe to the first Rocky movie or the Rocky series because they both came out at the same time. And a lot of people call Ashita no Joe the Japanese Rocky, or in some cases, Rocky Joe. But I think that kind of dumbs it down, and I think it does a major disservice to both franchises. While both franchises are the success stories of professional boxers who work themselves up from shady backgrounds, that's about it as far as the comparisons go. The first half of Ashita is pretty much all about Joe's hatred of Rikishi, and the second half is all about the shame Joe feels for killing him, and his continued shame as he continues to go on permanently destroying people in the ring, moving upwards but at the serious cost to those around him and the detriment to his opponents. Whereas meanwhile, Rocky is about a goon who becomes a legitimate boxer, gets married, gets a robot, achieves the American dream in under 5 years, And then over time, it gets a little sadder as everyone around him dies from either boxing or old age. Alright, that's my full take on the Ashita no Joe series. If anyone wants me to get into its two modern spin-offs, Megalobox and Nomad, let me know because I thought they were both great and amazing in their own individual ways. I was Buster Green, and please subscribe because every once in a while I do a deep dive video like this. Thank you guys, I'll be around. Peace out.